For 15 years, I thought I was building a life with the man I loved. But when he stood up in that packed courtroom and screamed those two words at me, everything I believed about loyalty, family, and justice shattered in an instant. What happened next changed everything, and reminded me that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales when you least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Vasquez, and at 42, I thought I had learned to read people. After all, I'd spent the last decade running a small but successful catering business in Portland, Oregon, dealing with bridezillas, demanding corporate clients, and every personality type imaginable. I prided myself on being able to spot trouble from a mile away, but somehow, I had been completely blind to the man sleeping next to me every night. The morning everything began to unravel started like any other Tuesday in March. Rain drummed against the windows of our modest, two-story house on Elm Street, and the smell of coffee mixed with the vanilla candles I always lit during my morning routine. I was reviewing invoices for the Henderson wedding, a massive event I'd been planning for months, when my phone buzzed with a text from my business partner and best friend, Sofia Chen. "Emergency meeting, coffee shop on 5th. Can you come now?" Sofia wasn't the dramatic type. In the 3 years we'd been business partners, she'd never once used the word emergency, unless someone was literally bleeding or the health department was at our door. I grabbed my raincoat and keys, calling out to my husband Marcus that I'd be back in an hour. "Whatever," came his muffled response from the bedroom. He'd been working late shifts at the construction company and had grown increasingly distant over the past few months. I attributed it to stress. The economy had been tough on blue-collar workers, and Marcus had always been the type to internalize his worries rather than share them. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few students hunched over laptops, and an elderly man reading the newspaper. Sofia sat in our usual corner booth, her normally perfectly styled black hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Elena," she said without preamble, "there's something you need to know about the Henderson contract." I slid into the booth across from her, immediately on alert. The Henderson wedding was our biggest contract to date, a 3-day affair with rehearsal dinner, ceremony, and reception that would net us nearly $30,000. It was the kind of job that would establish our reputation among Portland's elite social circles. "What kind of something?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. Sofia pulled out her phone and placed it on the table between us. "I got a call yesterday from Janet Henderson's assistant. They're canceling the contract." The words hit me like ice water. "Canceling? But the wedding is in 6 weeks. We've already ordered everything, booked the vendors, put deposits down." "That's not the worst part." Sofia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Elena, they're not just canceling, they're claiming breach of contract. They're saying we failed to deliver on our promised services, and they're demanding a full refund plus damages." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "That's impossible. We've delivered everything on schedule. The tasting went perfectly. All the confirmations are in place." "They have documentation," Sofia interrupted, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table. "Look at this." My hands shook as I unfolded what appeared to be a modified version of our original contract. But this wasn't the contract I remembered signing. The delivery dates were different, the menu specifications had been altered, and worst of all, there were clauses about premium service packages that we'd never discussed, much less agreed to provide. "This isn't our contract," I said, my voice rising. "Sofia, this isn't what we signed. Someone changed this." "I know that, and you know that, but they have Marcus's signature on it as your business representative." The coffee shop seemed to tilt around me. "Marcus's signature? What are you talking about?" "Marcus has nothing to do with our business. He's never signed anything for Bella Vista Catering." Sofia's expression grew even more grave. "Elena, I did some digging after I got that call. I contacted the Henderson's attorney, thinking, maybe we could clear this up quickly. But then he told me something that made my blood run cold." She paused, seeming to gather courage. He said Marcus approached them 3 weeks ago claiming he was your business manager. He told them you were having mental health issues and couldn't be trusted to handle the contract details anymore. The words felt like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe for a moment, couldn't think. That's not possible. Marcus would never. Why would he even? There's more. Sofia's voice was gentle but relentless. I called our bank to check on the business account. Elena, $43,000 has been transferred out over the past month. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger automatic alerts, but it's all gone. The elderly man at the next table looked over as I gasped audibly. $43,000 was everything we had. Our working capital, our emergency fund, the money we'd saved to expand the business, and maybe finally hire additional staff. It represented 3 years of 14-hour days, skipped vacations, and every penny of profit we'd reinvested in our dream. Who authorized the transfers? I asked, though I already knew the answer was going to destroy me. The bank says they were authorized by Marcus Vasquez, using power of attorney documents filed 6 weeks ago. Sofia reached across the table and took my hand. Elena, I'm so sorry. I think your husband has been planning this for a while. I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, staring at the forged documents and bank statements Sofia had brought. Every number, every signature, every carefully orchestrated detail painted a picture of methodical betrayal. Marcus hadn't just stolen our money. He'd systematically destroyed our business reputation and set us up to take the fall for a contract we could never fulfill. When I finally drove home, my hands were steady on the steering wheel, but my mind was racing. I needed to confront Marcus. Needed to understand why the man I'd loved and trusted for 15 years had decided to destroy everything I'd worked for. But more than that, I needed to figure out how to save my business and my future. The house was quiet when I walked in. Marcus's work boots were by the door, and I could hear the television playing in the living room. I found him on the couch, beer in hand, watching some mindless action movie. He looked so normal, so much like the man I'd shared breakfast with just hours earlier, that for a moment I wondered if Sofia had made some terrible mistake. Hey, he said without looking away from the screen. How was your meeting with Sofia? Productive, I said carefully, sitting down on the chair across from him. We talked about the Henderson wedding. Something flickered across his face, so quickly I almost missed it. But I'd been watching people's faces for years, reading the subtle tells that meant a client was about to change their mind, or a vendor was about to admit they'd made a mistake. Marcus was nervous.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
That's the big fancy one, right? He said, still not meeting my eyes. Yes, the one worth $30,000. The one that's been keeping us afloat while we build our client base. I kept my voice level, conversational. Funny thing, though. It seems like there's been some confusion about the contract terms. Now he did look at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Guilt mixed with something that might have been panic. What kind of confusion? The kind where someone forged documents and stole money from our business account. I watched his face carefully as I spoke. The kind where someone claiming to be my business manager told our biggest client that I was mentally unstable. Marcus set down his beer with deliberate care. The casual mask he'd been wearing slipped away, replaced by something cold and calculating. Elena, I think you're getting a little paranoid. Maybe Sofia's the one you should be worried about. Sofia didn't have access to our account, Marcus. Sofia didn't forge my signature on power of attorney documents. Sofia didn't convince the Hendersons that I was having a breakdown. My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. But you know who did have access to all of that? You know who I trusted with our personal banking information because he was my husband? He stood up abruptly, towering over me. Marcus had always been a big man, 6'3" with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who worked with his body for a living. I'd always found his size comforting, protective. Now, for the first time in our marriage, I felt intimidated. You need to be very careful about what you're accusing me of, he said, his voice low and threatening. You're obviously under a lot of stress, and you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking perfectly clearly, I shot back, standing up to face him. I'm thinking that my husband of 15 years has systematically destroyed my business and stolen everything Sofia and I worked for. I'm thinking that the man I trusted with my life has been planning to ruin me for months. Ruin you? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Elena, you ruined yourself. Your little catering hobby was never going to amount to anything real. You're a dreamer, you always have been. You throw good money after bad chasing some fantasy about being a successful businesswoman, but you don't have what it takes. The word stung more than I expected. Hobby? Marcus, Bella Vista Catering has been profitable for 2 years. We've built a reputation. We have regular clients. You have a few rich housewives who throw you some pity work, he interrupted. That's not a real business. That's not a career. You're 42 years old, Elena. When are you going to grow up and accept that this isn't going to work? I stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the contempt that had probably been lurking beneath the surface for years. So you decided to prove your point by destroying it? By stealing our money and sabotaging our contracts? I decided to cut our losses before you dragged us both down with your delusions. Marcus stepped closer, and I instinctively backed away. The money you're so upset about? That was my money too. Money I earned working real jobs while you played restaurant with your friend. I had every right to redirect it towards something more practical. Redirect it where, Marcus? Where did $43,000 go? For a moment, he looked like he might not answer. Then his expression hardened. I invested it in a real opportunity. Frank Kozlowski is starting a new construction company, and he offered me a partnership. A chance to actually build something instead of pretending to run a business that caters birthday parties. The casual way he said it, as if my life's work was nothing more than an expensive hobby he'd finally gotten tired of funding, made something snap inside me. You stole money from my business to invest in your friend's company? Without even telling me? I made a practical decision about our financial future, something you've never been capable of doing. Marcus's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. You live in a fantasy world, Elena. You think because a few people complimented your cooking that you're some kind of entrepreneur. But successful businesses require real skills, planning, strategy, the ability to think beyond tomorrow's grocery list. Real skills like fraud and forgery? I shot back. Because that's what you did, Marcus. You forged documents and lied to our clients and stole money that didn't belong to you. I protected us from your bad decisions, he roared, his face flushing red. Everything I did was to prevent you from losing everything we had to your ridiculous pipe dreams. By ensuring I'd lose everything anyway? I was shouting now too, 15 years of suppressed frustrations pouring out. By making sure I'd not only lose the money but also face legal action for breach of contract? By telling our clients I was mentally unstable? Maybe because you are. Marcus stepped forward again, and this time I held my ground. Look at yourself, Elena. You're hysterical. You're making wild accusations. You're exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be trusted with important decisions. The gaslighting was so blatant, so deliberately cruel, that it took my breath away. For a split second, I actually wondered if he was right, if my anger and hurt were making me irrational. But then I thought about the documents Sofia had shown me, the careful planning that had gone into this betrayal, and I knew that whatever was happening to our marriage, I wasn't the one who had lost touch with reality. I want you to fix this, I said, my voice deadly calm. I want you to contact the Hendersons and tell them the truth. I want you to return every penny you stole from our account, and I want you to explain to me exactly why you thought you had the right to destroy 15 years of trust. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating his next move. Then he smiled, a cold, predatory expression I'd never seen on his face before. Or what? He asked. You'll divorce me? Take half of what we own? Elena, I hate to break it to you, but what we own isn't worth much. This house has been mortgaged twice to fund your business adventures. Our savings account, the one you think I emptied, was already close to zero thanks to your investments in kitchen equipment and marketing materials. I felt the ground shifting beneath me. What are you talking about? Our savings had nearly $60,000. Our savings had $12,000, Marcus corrected. The rest was money I borrowed against the house and our credit cards to keep your business afloat when you couldn't make payroll last year. Did you think that money just appeared? Did you think your little catering company was actually profitable enough to pay Sofia's salary and cover all your expenses? The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I thought back to the previous year, to the months when our client base had been smaller and irregularly paying. I'd been so focused on building the business, so determined to make it work, that I hadn't questioned where the money was coming from when Sofia and I paid ourselves modest salaries and covered our operating expenses. You never told me we were borrowing money, I whispered. Because I knew you'd panic and want to shut everything down, Marcus replied. I thought if I gave you enough time and resources, you'd eventually build something viable. But it's been 3 years, Elena. 3 years of pouring money into a business that's never going to be more than break even. But the Henderson contract. The Henderson contract was going to cost us more than we'd make. You underbid it by at least 40% because you were so desperate to land a prestige client. Even if everything had gone perfectly, we'd have lost money. Marcus sat back down on the couch, suddenly looking tired. I did what I had to do to prevent us from going deeper into debt. I sank into the chair across from him, my mind reeling. Was it possible that everything I'd believed about our business success was wrong? Had I been so naive, so determined to prove myself, that I'd missed the signs that we were failing? Even if that's true, I said slowly, even if the business wasn't as profitable as I thought, that doesn't give you the right to sabotage it. It doesn't excuse forging documents or lying to clients or stealing money. I didn't steal anything, Marcus said firmly. I redirected our resources toward a genuine opportunity. Frank's construction company has real contracts, real profit potential. If his partnership offer works out, we could be debt-free within 2 years. And if it doesn't work out, Marcus shrugged, then we're no worse off than we would have been letting you continue to throw money at a failing business. The casual dismissal of everything I'd worked for, everything I'd believed in, was almost more painful than the financial betrayal. I'd spent 3 years building Bella Vista Catering from nothing, learning about food service regulations and vendor management and customer relations. I'd thought I was becoming the kind of woman who could run her own business, make her own decisions, build something meaningful. But according to Marcus, I'd just been playing dress-up with someone else's money. I need to think, I said, standing up. I need to talk to Sofia and figure out what our options are. Elena? Marcus called as I headed toward the stairs. His voice was gentler now, almost pleading. I know you're angry, and I know this isn't how you wanted things to happen. But I'm trying to save us. Both of us. This partnership with Frank could be the fresh start we need. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at him. Did you ever think about asking me what I wanted? Did it ever occur to you that maybe I should have been part of the decision about our future? Of course, he said. But you would have said no. You would have fought me on it, insisted on throwing more money at the catering business, and we would have ended up losing everything anyway. Sometimes someone has to make the hard choices. Someone, I repeated. Not both of us. Not your wife and partner. Just you. I'm better at this kind of thing, Marcus said matter-of-factly. Business decisions, financial planning, seeing the big picture. You're good at other things. Cooking, organizing, making people feel welcome. But strategic thinking isn't your strength. I climbed the stairs without responding, his words echoing in my head. According to my husband of 15 years, I was good at cooking and organizing. Essentially, I was good at being a more elaborate version of a housewife. The idea that I might be capable of running a real business, making important decisions, building something significant, was apparently beyond his imagination. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. This morning, I'd been a successful small business owner preparing for the biggest contract of my career. Now, I was apparently a deluded woman whose husband had been covering her failures for years before finally deciding to cut his losses. But something didn't add up. If Bella Vista Catering was really as unprofitable as Marcus claimed, why had Sofia been so excited about our growth trajectory? Why had we been getting referrals and repeat clients? Why had the Henderson family chosen us over more established caterers? I pulled out my laptop and logged into our business banking account, something I'd always handled myself despite Marcus having access for emergency purposes. The statements told a different story than the one Marcus had just presented. Yes, there had been lean months, especially in our first year. But over the past 18 months, our deposits had steadily increased, and our operating expenses had stabilized. We'd been building toward profitability, not spiraling toward failure. More importantly, I could see exactly where the recent transfers had gone. Marcus hadn't been covering our business losses. He'd been systematically draining our working capital just as we were hitting our stride. The timing wasn't coincidental. He'd waited until we had built up substantial reserves, then taken everything just before our biggest contract was set to launch. I spent the next hour reviewing every transaction, every deposit, every expense report. By the time I was finished, I knew beyond any doubt that Marcus had lied about our financial situation. Bella Vista Catering might not have been making us rich, but it was sustainable and growing. We'd been on track to have our best year yet, which meant Marcus hadn't sabotaged my business to save us from financial ruin. He'd sabotaged it for some other reason, and whatever that reason was, it was worth $43,000 to him. I closed the laptop and stared out the window at the rain-soaked street. Somewhere in the city, Sofia was probably trying to figure out how to salvage our reputation and avoid legal action from the Hendersons. Our employees, the part-time kitchen staff and servers who depended on us for supplemental income, would be out of work. The vendors we'd built relationships with over 3 years would be left unpaid. But more than the financial damage, more than the professional humiliation, what hurt most was the realization that the person I trusted most in the world had systematically undermined everything I'd tried to build. Marcus hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen my confidence, my future, and my faith in my own judgment. I picked up my phone and dialed Sofia's number. "Elena?" She answered on the first ring. "Are you okay? How did Marcus react when you confronted him?" "He confessed," I said simply. "He took the money, he sabotaged the Henderson contract, and he forged the power of attorney documents." "Oh, honey," Sofia breathed. "I'm so sorry. What did he say? Why did he do it?" "He claims he was trying to save us from my bad business decisions. He says the catering company was never profitable and he invested our money in a construction partnership that will supposedly pay off better." I paused, looking at the financial data still open on my laptop screen. "But Sofia, I've been looking at our books. We weren't failing. We were actually doing really well." "I know we were," Sofia said firmly. "Elena, our profit margins have been increasing for months. We've got a waiting list of potential clients. The Henderson wedding was going to establish us as one of the premier caterers in Portland." "Then why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "I don't know," Sofia admitted. "But Elena, we need to talk about what happens next. The Hendersons are threatening legal action, and we need to decide how to respond. If Marcus really did forge those documents and sabotage the contract, we might have grounds for criminal charges." "Criminal charges?" The word sent a chill through me. "Sofia, I can't send my husband to jail." "You might not have a choice," she said gently. "Elena, what he did wasn't just morally wrong. It was fraud. If we don't take action, we could be held liable for everything he did in our name." I knew she was right, but the thought of involving the police, of turning my marriage into a criminal matter, felt overwhelming. "Can we meet tomorrow morning? I need tonight to think about all of this." "Of course. But Elena, don't let him intimidate you into backing down. What he did was serious, and you deserve justice." After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of our bedroom and tried to imagine what justice would look like. Marcus in handcuffs? Our marriage ending in a courtroom? A future where I had to rebuild my business, my finances, and my life from scratch? Or maybe justice would look like finding a way to repair the damage, restore the money, and save what was left of everything I'd worked for. Maybe there was still a chance to fix this without destroying what remained of our life together. But as I listened to Marcus moving around downstairs, turning off lights and checking locks in the routine that had become as familiar as breathing over 15 years of marriage, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd already destroyed us both. The man I'd fallen in love with, the partner I'd trusted with my dreams and my future, had been calculating my downfall for months. And tomorrow, I was going to have to decide whether to let him get away with it or fight back with everything I had left. The next morning brought no clarity, only the sharp realization that sleeping in the same house as Marcus felt like sharing space with a stranger. I woke before dawn, my body tense and alert in a way that suggested my subconscious had been processing the betrayal even while I slept. Marcus was already gone. His construction crew started early, and for once I was grateful for his absence. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen, standing at the window that overlooked our small backyard garden. The tomato plants I'd started from seed were beginning to show their first green buds, and the herb garden Sofia and I had planned for sourcing fresh ingredients was thriving. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday morning, but the context had shifted so completely that it felt like viewing someone else's life. Sofia arrived at 9, carrying a manila folder thick with documents and wearing the grim expression of someone who'd spent the night researching legal precedents. We sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I'd planned countless menus and mapped out business strategies, and she spread out what looked like the aftermath of our professional lives. "I've been on the phone since 6 this morning," she began without preamble. "First with my cousin David. He's a criminal attorney. Then with our business insurance company. Then with 3 different civil litigation firms." She pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in her neat handwriting. "The good news is that we have options. The bad news is that every option involves a fight." I poured her coffee and sat down, steeling myself for whatever she was about to tell me. "How bad is it really?" "Legally speaking, Marcus committed several felonies. Wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and possibly money laundering depending on how he moved the funds. The district attorney's office would probably be very interested in prosecuting this case." Sofia paused to sip her coffee. "But criminally prosecuting your husband comes with complications you need to understand." "What kind of complications?" "If Marcus is convicted, he'll likely face significant jail time and be required to pay restitution. But Elena, people in prison don't earn construction worker wages. If he's incarcerated, any chance of recovering the money quickly disappears." Sofia's expression was gentle but direct. "You'd have justice, but you might not have your business back." I absorbed this information while watching steam rise from my coffee cup. "What about civil litigation? That's more promising for recovery, but it's also more complex. We could sue Marcus personally for theft and fraud, but we'd also need to address the Henderson situation separately. They're claiming breach of contract and demanding damages that could exceed what Marcus actually stole." Sofia flipped through several pages of notes. "The challenge is that some of their claims might be legitimate even if the underlying contract was forged." "How is that possible?" "Because we did accept deposits from them, and we did fail to deliver services, even though the failure was caused by sabotage rather than incompetence. From a legal standpoint, the Hendersons suffered real damages regardless of why we couldn't fulfill our obligations." Sofia looked up from her notes. "David thinks we can probably get the criminal charges against Marcus to provide leverage in the civil case, but it's going to be a long process." I felt the weight of months or potentially years of legal battles settling on my shoulders. "What about just trying to work something out directly? Marcus said the money went to some construction partnership. Maybe there's a way to recover it without involving the courts." Sofia's expression darkened. "Elena, I need to tell you something else I discovered last night. This Frank Kozlowski that Marcus mentioned, I looked him up. His previous construction company filed for bankruptcy 18 months ago after defaulting on 3 major contracts. He's been sued twice for taking deposits and not completing work." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. "So the money is probably gone." "It's very likely gone, yes. But Elena, that might actually work in our favor legally. If Marcus invested stolen funds in a venture he knew or should have known was likely to fail, that demonstrates intent to permanently deprive us of the money. It strengthens both the criminal and civil cases." We spent the next 2 hours going through every document Sofia had assembled, every possible legal strategy, every potential outcome. By the time she left, my head was spinning with terms like fiduciary duty and constructive fraud and punitive damages. But underneath the legal complexity, the situation was brutally simple. My husband had destroyed my business and my financial security, and getting either back was going to require a war. That afternoon, I drove to the offices of Bella Vista Catering, a converted warehouse space in southeast Portland that Sofia and I had been renting for the past year. Walking into the commercial kitchen we'd designed and equipped together felt like visiting a crime scene. The stainless steel prep tables gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the walk-in cooler hummed quietly in the background, but everything felt hollow and purposeless. Our part-time staff had been calling and texting since yesterday, confused about why their shifts for Henderson wedding prep had been canceled. Maria Santos, our head server and the single mother of 2 young kids, had left 3 increasingly worried voicemails, asking if there was a problem with payroll. I owed these people honesty, even if the truth was going to cost them their jobs. I called a staff meeting for 4 o'clock, and by the time everyone arrived, I'd rehearsed my explanation enough times to deliver it without breaking down. Maria, our sous chef Jeremy, and 3 of our regular servers sat around the small table in our office space, their faces reflecting growing concern as I explained what had happened. So basically, my husband stole our operating capital and sabotaged our biggest contract, I concluded. I'm going to fight this legally, but in the meantime, I can't guarantee when or if we'll be able to resume normal operations. The silence that followed was devastating. These weren't just employees. They were people I'd worked alongside for months. People whose children I knew by name. People who'd trusted their financial stability to the business Sofia and I had built. Maria was the first to speak. Elena, is there anything we can do to help? I mean, besides finding other jobs. Like what? Well, you said the Hendersons are claiming breach of contract. What if we could still deliver the wedding services somehow? Maybe not the full package, but enough to minimize the damages? Maria leaned forward, her expression intense. I've been working events for 8 years. I know caterers who might let us use their kitchens, vendors who might work with us on credit if we explain the situation. Jeremy nodded enthusiastically. I've got connections too. My previous chef job was at Hotel Monaco. I might be able to get us access to their prep kitchens during off hours. The offer was generous and heartbreaking and completely impractical. Guys, I appreciate this more than you know, but even if we could somehow pull together the Henderson wedding, I don't have money to pay you. Marcus cleaned out the business account. So pay us when the legal stuff gets sorted out, Maria said matter-of-factly. Elena, you gave me a chance when no other catering company would hire a server with a criminal record. You worked around my custody schedule. You helped me get health insurance for my kids. You treated me like family instead of just labor. She looked around the table at the others, who were nodding in agreement. Maybe it's time for us to return the favor. I stared at them, overwhelmed by their loyalty and frustrated by my inability to accept it. I can't ask you to work for free on the chance that I might be able to pay you back someday. You're not asking, Jeremy pointed out. We're offering. And honestly, Elena, we all need this business to survive as much as you do. If Bella Vista goes under, we don't just lose these jobs. We lose references, reputation, connections. Sometimes you have to invest in your own future. Over the next hour, they laid out a plan that was ambitious, risky, and probably doomed to failure. But it was also the first thing in 24 hours that felt like fighting back instead of just absorbing damage. Maria would contact her network of freelance event staff to assemble a crew willing to work on deferred payment. Jeremy would negotiate kitchen rental time and coordinate with our regular vendors to see who might extend credit. Our servers would handle setup, service, and breakdown with skeleton crews supplemented by Maria's contacts. It wouldn't be the lavish affair we'd originally planned, but it might be enough to fulfill our basic contractual obligations and avoid the worst of the legal damages. More importantly, it would demonstrate that Marcus's sabotage hadn't actually destroyed our capability, only our resources. There's one more thing, Maria said, as we were wrapping up the meeting. Elena, I think you should document everything that happens from now on. If this goes to court, you'll want to show that you did everything possible to minimize damages and honor your commitments. She was right, of course. I started that night, creating a detailed log of every conversation, every attempt to salvage the Henderson contract, every step we took to rebuild. It felt like preparing for battle, which I suppose was exactly what it was. Marcus came home late that evening, smelling like beer and exhaust fumes. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, working on vendor negotiations and damage control, when he walked in. He glanced at my screen and frowned. Still playing business owner? He asked, his tone dismissive. Actually, I'm trying to save us from a lawsuit that could cost us everything we own, I replied without looking up. The Hendersons are claiming damages that go beyond what you stole. If I can't fulfill at least part of the contract, they could come after the house. Marcus paused in the doorway, and I could feel his attention sharpen. What do you mean, come after the house? I mean, they could sue us personally for breach of contract. And since you used our joint assets to fund your construction partnership, everything we own could be at risk. I finally looked up at him. Did you think about that when you were sabotaging our business? Did you consider that destroying my contracts might destroy your assets too? For the first time since this started, Marcus looked genuinely concerned rather than dismissive. Elena, that's not possible. Business contracts can't touch personal assets. They can if you're not properly incorporated, which we weren't because you convinced me it was unnecessary paperwork. They can if there's evidence of fraud or misrepresentation, which there is, because you forged documents. And they can definitely touch assets that were illegally transferred to fund other ventures. I closed the laptop and faced him directly. Marcus, your scheme didn't just hurt me. It put both of us in legal jeopardy. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, running his hands through his hair. This is getting out of hand. Elena, you need to find a way to make this go away. Make it go away? I stared at him in disbelief. Marcus, you committed multiple felonies and exposed us to civil liability that could cost us our home. I can't make that disappear. Then fix it, he said, his voice taking on the demanding tone I was beginning to recognize as his default when he felt cornered. You created this problem by building a business you couldn't sustain. Now you need to solve it. The audacity of blaming me for the consequences of his own criminal behavior was breathtaking. I created this problem? Marcus, I created a successful business. You destroyed it. You created a house of cards that collapsed the moment someone applied real scrutiny, he shot back. If your business model was actually sustainable, my actions wouldn't have mattered. I looked at him across our kitchen table, this man I'd shared 15 years of my life with, and realized I was seeing him clearly for the first time. Marcus hadn't just stolen money and sabotaged contracts. He'd been systematically undermining my confidence and judgment for years, positioning himself as the practical one, the rational one, the one who understood how the real world worked. Every time I'd expressed pride in our business growth or excitement about new opportunities, he'd found subtle ways to diminish it, to remind me that I was playing at being a businesswoman rather than actually being one. You know what I think really happened? I said quietly. I think my business was succeeding, and that terrified you. I think you couldn't stand the idea that I might actually be capable of building something significant without your help or guidance, so you sabotaged it and convinced yourself you were protecting me from my own incompetence. Marcus's face flushed red. That's ridiculous psychological nonsense. Is it? Then explain to me why you waited until we had $43,000 in working capital before you decided we were failing. Explain why you sabotaged our biggest contract right when we were positioned to break into the high-end market. Explain why you never once suggested we discuss changing our business strategy instead of just stealing the money and lying to our clients. Because discussing it with you would have been pointless, Marcus exploded. You would have fought me, made emotional arguments, refused to see reason. Just like you're doing now. So you decided for both of us. I decided for our family, yes. Someone had to be the adult. The phrase hung in the air between us like a challenge. Marcus apparently saw me as a child who needed his guidance and protection. Someone incapable of making rational decisions about my own life and work. And for 15 years, I'd internalized enough of that perspective to second-guess myself whenever he questioned my judgment. But sitting there looking at the evidence of his betrayal, listening to him blame me for the consequences of his crimes, I felt something crystallize inside me. Marcus wasn't the practical protector he'd convinced both of us he was. He was a man so threatened by his wife's success that he'd rather destroy it than acknowledge her capability. I'm filing charges against you, I said calmly. Criminal charges for fraud and theft, and civil charges for damages to the business. Marcus's expression shifted from anger to shock. Elena, You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. I'm your husband. We can work this out between us. You don't involve the police in family matters. You stopped being my husband when you decided to become my saboteur, I replied. And this stopped being a family matter when you committed felonies. Marcus stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. If you call the police on me, Elena, there's no coming back from that. You'll destroy our marriage. You already destroyed our marriage. I'm just deciding whether to let you destroy everything else too. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out if this was a bluff he could call or a genuine threat he needed to take seriously. Finally, he seemed to make some internal decision. Fine, he said, his voice cold and flat. But if you do this, don't expect me to make it easy on you. I know things about your business that could make your legal problems much worse. What kind of things? Things like the fact that you've been paying some of your staff under the table to avoid payroll taxes. Things like the health permit violations you covered up instead of reporting. Things like the fact that you've been using residential kitchen space for commercial food prep, which is illegal in Oregon. Marcus's smile was cruel and satisfied. You want to play hardball, Elena? I can play hardball too. Every accusation hit like a physical blow because they all contained grains of truth twisted into weapons. Yes, I'd occasionally paid cash to staff who requested it for personal financial reasons. Yes, there had been minor health permit issues that I'd corrected immediately, rather than going through the formal reporting process. Yes, I'd done some initial recipe development in our home kitchen before we could afford commercial space. But Marcus was describing routine industry practices as if they were serious crimes, and the fact that he'd been collecting this information suggested a level of premeditation that chilled me. So what are you saying? I asked. That if I hold you accountable for stealing $43,000, you'll try to get me arrested for payroll technicalities? I'm saying that if you want to make this a legal battle, you should be prepared for the consequences. I've been watching your business for 3 years, Elena. I know exactly where all the bodies are buried. The threat was clear and devastating. Even if my supposed violations were minor compared to his theft and fraud, defending against criminal charges would cost legal fees I couldn't afford and destroy any remaining credibility Bella Vista Catering might have. Marcus was essentially offering me a choice. Let him get away with destroying my business, or risk being destroyed even more completely. But as I sat there absorbing his ultimatum, I realized something important. Marcus was threatening me because he was scared. If he truly believed he'd done nothing wrong, if he genuinely thought his actions were justified, he wouldn't need to intimidate me into silence. The fact that he was resorting to threats meant he knew exactly how serious his legal exposure was. Marcus, I said quietly, if you think you can blackmail me into letting you get away with fraud, you don't know me as well as you think you do. His confident expression faltered slightly. Elena, be smart about this. We can still fix this situation if we work together. No, we can't. Because working together would require trust. And you destroyed that when you decided to lie to me for months, while systematically undermining everything I built. I stood up and faced him directly. I'm calling the police tomorrow morning. I'm filing charges. And I'm going to do everything in my power to recover the money you stole and restore the business you sabotaged. Even if it means going to prison yourself. Even if it means risking everything I have left to make sure you don't get away with this. Marcus stared at me for another long moment, then turned and walked out of the kitchen. I heard him moving around upstairs, opening drawers and closet doors. 20 minutes later, he came back down, carrying a duffel bag and his work clothes. I'm staying at Frank's place for a while, he announced. I think we both need some space to cool down and think clearly. Take all the space you need, I replied. But Marcus? The cooling down period is over. Tomorrow morning, I start fighting back. He paused at the front door, looking back at me one last time. Elena, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. No, I said firmly. The biggest mistake of my life was trusting you. After Marcus left, I sat alone in our kitchen and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd just committed to. In the span of 24 hours, I'd gone from being a small business owner with a difficult marriage to being a crime victim preparing to prosecute her own husband. The legal battles ahead would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating. There was no guarantee I'd recover the stolen money or save the business, or avoid the criminal charges Marcus had threatened. But for the first time since discovering the forged postcards, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just reacting. Marcus had spent months calculating how to destroy everything I'd built. Now it was my turn to calculate how to rebuild it. I pulled out my phone and called Sofia. "How did it go with Marcus?" she asked immediately. "About as badly as you'd expect. He threatened to turn me in for various business violations if I pressed charges against him." Sofia was quiet for a moment. "Elena, how serious are these supposed violations?" "Honestly, they're mostly technicalities and industry standard practices that look worse than they are. But in the context of a criminal investigation, they could be problems." Quote, "David needs to know about this," Sofia said firmly. "If Marcus is going to fight dirty, we need to be prepared." "There's something else," I said. "I met with our staff today, and they want to try to salvage the Henderson wedding. They're willing to work on deferred payment to help us fulfill at least part of the contract." "Elena, that's incredibly generous of them, but is it realistic? We don't have working capital, we don't have our usual vendor relationships, and we don't have time to properly plan a 3-day event." "Maybe not the event we originally planned," I admitted. "But Maria thinks we can put together something basic that would satisfy our minimum contractual obligations and reduce the damages we're facing." Sofia was quiet again, and I could hear her thinking. "It's risky," she finally said. "If we attempt the wedding and fail, it could make our legal position worse. But if we don't attempt it, the Hendersons definitely have grounds for maximum damages. So we're damned if we do and damned if we don't." "Pretty much. But Elena, if we're going down anyway, we might as well go down fighting." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's face when he made his threats, heard the casual cruelty in his voice when he dismissed 3 years of work as playing business. But I also kept thinking about Maria's offer to work without pay, Jeremy's willingness to call in favors from his previous jobs, and Sofia's determination to fight this battle alongside me. Marcus had calculated that destroying my business would be easy, because he assumed I was weak, naive, and dependent on him for all the practical aspects of life. But he'd made his calculations based on the version of me that existed at the beginning of our marriage, the young woman who'd deferred to his judgment and accepted his assessment of her capabilities. He hadn't accounted for the woman I'd become over 3 years of running a business, solving problems, managing crises, and proving to myself that I was capable of more than he'd ever imagined. That woman wasn't going to let him win without a fight. The next morning, I woke up early and drove to the downtown police station. The detective who took my statement was a middle-aged woman named Lieutenant Rodriguez, who listened to my story with the professional detachment of someone who'd heard every possible variation of domestic financial abuse. "Mrs. Vasquez," she said when I finished explaining everything, "I want you to understand that prosecuting your husband is going to be a difficult process. Financial crimes are complex to investigate, and domestic cases often involve complicated motives and conflicting narratives. I understand that. But, Lieutenant Rodriguez, if I don't hold him accountable for this, he's going to assume he can get away with anything. And honestly, I think he's done things like this before. I just haven't been paying close enough attention to catch him." She nodded slowly. "We'll need all the documentation you can provide. Bank statements, forged contracts, email communications, anything that demonstrates the pattern of fraudulent activity. And, Mrs. Vasquez, if your husband has threatened retaliation, you need to be very careful about your safety. Financial crimes and domestic violence often overlap." I hadn't thought about physical safety, but as Lieutenant Rodriguez spoke, I realized that Marcus's behavior over the past 2 days had been increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. The man who'd stolen my money and sabotaged my business might be capable of escalating to other forms of harm if he felt cornered. What kind of precautions should I take? Document any threats or intimidating behavior. Consider changing your locks and security codes. Let trusted friends know what's happening so they can check on you regularly. And don't hesitate to call us if you feel unsafe. After filing the police report, I drove to the law offices of Chen, Rodriguez and Associates, the firm Sofia's cousin David worked for. David Chen was in his early 30s, with the intense focus and rapid-fire speaking style of someone who'd built his reputation on complicated cases. He listened to my story while taking notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions about timing, documentation, or Marcus's specific statements. "Elena," he said when I finished, "your husband committed serious crimes, and you have strong evidence to support charges. But I need to be honest with you about the challenges we're facing." Such as? First, his threats to report you for business violations aren't entirely empty. Even if your practices were standard for small catering companies, a motivated prosecutor could potentially bring charges. We'd likely win, but the process would be expensive and damaging to your reputation. I nodded, having expected this assessment. Second, recovering the stolen money is going to be difficult even if we win the criminal case. If Marcus invested it in Frank Kozlowski's construction venture, and that venture fails, the money is probably gone permanently. And third, your husband appears to be preparing for a scorched earth defense strategy. He's going to argue that you knew about and approved his financial decisions, that your business was failing anyway, and that he was trying to prevent even greater losses. It's not a strong defense legally, but it could be effective with a jury. David leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "Elena, I want to make sure you understand what you're signing up for. This case could take months or years to resolve. It's going to be expensive, emotionally draining, and very public. Your business and personal finances will be scrutinized by opposing attorneys, who will be looking for any possible weakness they can exploit. What's the alternative? You could try to negotiate a settlement directly with Marcus. He returns what money he can, helps you satisfy the Henderson contract, and you agree not to press criminal charges." I thought about this for a moment, imagining the conversation where I begged Marcus to give back the money he'd stolen and help me salvage the business he'd sabotaged. "David, if I don't hold him accountable for this, what's to stop him from doing it again? What's to stop him from continuing to undermine me for the rest of our marriage?" "Nothing," David admitted. "Elena, in my experience, people who commit this kind of calculated financial abuse don't stop unless they're forced to stop." "Then I guess I need to force him to stop." David smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. "In that case, let's talk about strategy." 3 weeks later, I stood in the hallway outside courtroom 4B of the Multnomah County Courthouse, adjusting the navy blue blazer Sofia had helped me pick out for today's hearing. The preliminary hearing would determine whether there was enough evidence to proceed with criminal charges against Marcus, and my testimony would be crucial in establishing the prosecution's case. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of legal preparation, desperate business salvage efforts, and the slow dissolution of everything I'd thought was permanent in my life. True to their word, Maria and Jeremy had assembled a skeleton crew to attempt a scaled-down version of the Henderson wedding, working out of borrowed kitchen spaces and calling in every favor they'd accumulated over years in the Portland catering scene. They'd managed to pull together something that resembled our original proposal. It wasn't the elegant 3-day affair we'd planned, but it was functional, professional, and delivered on time. More importantly, it demonstrated that Marcus's sabotage hadn't destroyed our underlying capability, only our resources. The Hendersons, impressed by our efforts to honor our commitments despite impossible circumstances, had agreed to accept the modified services and drop their lawsuit in exchange for a partial refund we couldn't afford, but somehow managed to scrape together through equipment sales and personal loans. David had been right about one thing. The investigation process was invasive and exhausting. Detective Lieutenant Rodriguez and her financial crimes unit had spent hours going through every bank record, every contract, every email communication between Marcus and me over the past year. They'd interviewed our staff, our vendors, our clients, and even our neighbors, who might have witnessed Marcus's comings and goings during the months he was systematically draining our accounts. What they'd discovered was even worse than I'd initially realized. Marcus hadn't just stolen the $43,000 from our business account. He'd also been skimming smaller amounts from our personal savings, taking cash advances on credit cards I didn't know existed, and even borrowing money against my car title without my knowledge. In total, his financial crimes had cost us nearly $70,000 over the course of 8 months. The Frank Kozlowski construction partnership, as Sofia had suspected, turned out to be a complete fraud. Frank had taken Marcus's investment along with money from at least 6 other people, then disappeared entirely. His previous bankruptcy hadn't been the result of honest business failure. It had been part of a pattern of taking investments and vanishing before completing any actual work. Marcus had been so eager to prove that he could make better financial decisions than his delusional wife, that he'd fallen for a scam that should have been obvious to anyone who did basic due diligence. But the most devastating discovery had come from my own investigation into our marriage's financial history. Going back through years of bank statements and tax returns, I'd found evidence that Marcus had been systematically undermining my financial independence for our entire relationship. Small amounts diverted from joint accounts, investment opportunities I'd expressed interest in that somehow never materialized, business loans I'd applied for that were mysteriously rejected despite strong credit and cash flow projections. It wasn't just the recent theft that had been calculated. It was 15 years of subtle financial sabotage designed to keep me dependent on his income and uncertain about my own capabilities. Every time I tried to build something independent, Marcus had found ways to ensure it struggled or failed, then positioned himself as the voice of reason, explaining why my dreams were impractical. Now, standing outside the courtroom where Marcus would face the consequences of his crimes, I felt a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. The man I'd loved and trusted had never been my partner. He'd been my saboteur, my underminer, my greatest obstacle to becoming the person I was capable of being. David emerged from the courtroom looking confident but focused. "Elena, are you ready for this? Remember, today is just about establishing probable cause for the charges. Marcus's attorney is going to try to muddy the waters and make this seem like a civil dispute rather than criminal behavior. But we have strong evidence." I nodded, checking my watch. Sofia was parking the car and would be here any moment to provide moral support. What should I expect from Marcus? I haven't seen him since he moved out. He'll probably try to appear reasonable and victimized. His lawyer is going to paint him as a concerned husband who made difficult financial decisions to protect his family from his wife's poor business judgment. They'll argue that everything he did with implied consent because you were married and sharing resources. Even though he forged my signature and lied to our clients? Even though... Elena, remember that his defense doesn't have to be true or even plausible. It just has to create enough doubt to make prosecution difficult. Stay focused on the facts, answer only the questions you're asked, and don't let him provoke you into emotional responses. Sofia arrived just as David finished his briefing, carrying a folder with additional documentation we might need, and wearing the expression of someone prepared for battle. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd thrown herself into helping me rebuild both the business and my legal case, with the fierce loyalty of someone who understood that our friendship and our professional partnership were both at stake. "How are you feeling?" she asked, squeezing my hand. "Terrified and determined in equal measure," I admitted, but ready to finally tell the truth about what he did to us. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly surreal. Marcus sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of confidence that comes from winning cases most people would consider unwinnable. He'd lost weight and looked older, wearing a navy suit I'd never seen before, and glasses he didn't usually need for anything but reading. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw a flicker of something that might have been regret, but it was quickly replaced by the cold calculation I'd come to recognize as his default expression when he felt cornered. Marcus had clearly decided that his best defense was to portray me as an unstable woman whose business failures had driven her to false accusations against her devoted husband. Judge Patricia Hendricks was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd heard every possible variation of human conflict and deception. She reviewed the case file briefly, then looked up at the prosecution table, where Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres sat with his stack of evidence and witness statements. "Mr. Torres, please present your opening statement regarding the charges against Marcus Vasquez." Torres stood and addressed the court with the practiced authority of someone who'd prosecuted hundreds of financial crimes cases. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendant engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud, forgery, and theft, targeting his wife's catering business. Over the course of 8 months, Mr. Vasquez forged documents, impersonated his wife to clients and vendors, and stole nearly $70,000 from business and personal accounts. He outlined the charges methodically: wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, and money laundering, while Marcus's attorney took notes and occasionally whispered to her client. The legal language made Marcus's actions sound clinical and impersonal, but I knew the human cost behind every charge. Furthermore, Torres continued, the defendant's actions were not impulsive mistakes but calculated decisions designed to destroy his wife's business while enriching himself through fraudulent investment schemes. The evidence will show premeditation, intent to permanently deprive the victims of their assets, and a pattern of deceptive behavior spanning multiple years. When Torres finished, Marcus's attorney, Janet Kowalski, stood to present her defense preview. Your Honor, this case represents a tragic misunderstanding between spouses about shared financial resources and business decisions. Mr. Vasquez is a devoted husband who became concerned about his wife's increasingly erratic business practices and mounting debts. His attempts to redirect their joint assets toward more stable investments have been mischaracterized as criminal behavior by a woman who refuses to accept responsibility for her own business failures. The characterization stung, but I'd expected it. Kowalski was setting up a defense based on questioning my competence, my mental state, and my right to control assets that Marcus considered jointly owned. It was exactly the kind of victim-blaming strategy that kept financial abuse victims from reporting crimes against them. Mrs. Vasquez, Judge Hendricks said, looking directly at me, please come forward to be sworn in. Walking to the witness stand felt like crossing a bridge I could never return over. For 15 years, I'd kept Marcus's criticisms and undermining behavior private, telling myself that all marriages had their challenges, and that airing our problems publicly would only make things worse. Now I was about to detail his betrayal in front of strangers, officially ending any possibility that we could repair our relationship. But as I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, I realized that Marcus had ended our relationship months ago, when he decided to steal from me rather than talk to me. I was just finally acknowledging reality. Torres began with basic questions about my background, the history of Bella Vista Catering, and my discovery of Marcus's fraud. I answered carefully, sticking to facts and chronology, avoiding emotional language that Kowalski could use to portray me as hysterical or unreliable. Mrs. Vasquez, when you discovered the forged Henderson contract, what was your husband's initial response? He claimed it was a coincidence and that he was just helping an old friend. But when I pressed for details, he became defensive and started questioning my mental state rather than explaining his actions. Did he acknowledge forging your signature on the modified contract? Not directly, but he didn't deny it either. Instead, he said I was being too emotional and needed to be more rational about our financial situation. Torres walked me through the bank records, the forged power of attorney documents, and Marcus's admission that he had taken the money to invest in Frank Kozlowski's construction partnership. With each piece of evidence, the picture of calculated betrayal became clearer and more damning. Mrs. Vasquez, at any point during your marriage, did you give your husband permission to forge your signature on business documents? Never. Did you give him permission to transfer money from your business accounts to personal investments without your knowledge? Absolutely not. Did you give him permission to impersonate you to clients and vendors? Number. I didn't even know he was doing any of these things until after the damage was done. When Torres finished his direct examination, I felt drained, but cautiously optimistic. We'd established a clear timeline of Marcus's crimes and demonstrated that his actions were deliberate and unauthorized. But I knew the difficult part was coming. Kowalski approached the witness stand with the predatory smile of someone about to dismantle everything I just said. Mrs. Vasquez, isn't it true that your catering business was struggling financially for most of its 3-year existence? We had challenges in our first year, like most new businesses, but we'd been profitable for the past 18 months. But you were carrying significant debt, correct? Equipment loans, vendor credit lines, outstanding invoices? We had normal business debt, yes, but our cash flow was positive, and our client base was growing. Kowalski pulled out a folder of documents. Your Honor, I'd like to present exhibits showing Mrs. Vasquez's business had accumulated over $40,000 in outstanding debts and had missed several payment deadlines in the months before my client took action to protect their joint assets. My heart sank as I recognized some of the documents. Vendor invoices that had been delayed by client payment issues, equipment financing that we'd been paying down steadily, and credit line balances that were well within our approved limits. Taken out of context and presented selectively, they painted a picture of a business in crisis rather than a growing company managing normal cash flow fluctuations. Mrs. Vasquez, isn't it true that you'd borrowed money from your personal savings multiple times to cover business expenses? Yes, but that money was always repaid when clients paid their invoices. And isn't it true that your husband expressed concerns about these financial practices on multiple occasions? I hesitated, remembering the arguments we'd had about my reinvesting profits back into the business rather than taking larger salaries. He questioned some of my business decisions, yes. In fact, didn't he specifically warn you that taking on the Henderson contract at your proposed pricing would result in significant losses? This was new information, and I wasn't sure how to respond. Marcus had never expressed specific concerns about the Henderson pricing, but Kowalski seemed to have documentation suggesting otherwise. I don't recall him making specific objections to our pricing strategy, I said carefully. Kowalski produced another document. Mrs. Vasquez, this is an email your husband sent to you 6 weeks before the Henderson event, expressing concerns about your cost projections and suggesting that you were underpricing your services. Do you remember receiving this email? I stared at the document, recognizing the email address but not remembering the message. It was possible Marcus had sent it and I'd missed it in the chaos of event planning, or possible he'd created it after the fact to support his defense. Either way, it suggested a level of premeditation to his legal strategy that was both impressive and terrifying. I don't specifically remember this email, but it's possible I missed it during a busy period. Mrs. Vasquez, is it possible that your husband's concerns about your business practices were legitimate, and that his actions were motivated by genuine desire to protect your family's financial stability rather than malicious intent to harm you? The question hung in the courtroom air like a trap. If I agreed that Marcus's concerns were legitimate, I'd be undermining the prosecution's case that his actions were purely criminal. But if I insisted they were completely unfounded, I'd be ignoring evidence that suggested at least some business challenges. Marcus may have had legitimate concerns about some aspects of our business, I said finally, but that doesn't give him the right to forge documents, steal money, and lie to our clients. If he was worried about our finances, the appropriate response would have been to discuss his concerns with me, not to commit fraud. Kowalski nodded as if I'd just proved her point. But Mrs. Vasquez, you just testified that communication about business matters was difficult in your marriage. Isn't it possible that my client felt he had no choice but to take unilateral action to prevent even greater financial losses? Taking unilateral action would mean discussing his concerns with a financial advisor or suggesting marriage counseling or even asking for a divorce, I replied, feeling my anger rising despite David's warnings to stay calm. It doesn't mean committing felonies. Mrs. Vasquez, you seem very angry about this situation. Would you say your emotional state has affected your ability to assess your husband's motivations objectively? The question was designed to make me look irrational, regardless of how I answered. If I denied being angry, I'd seem unrealistic given the circumstances. If I admitted to anger, Kowalski could argue that my emotions were clouding my judgment. I'm angry that my husband stole $70,000 and sabotaged my business, I said evenly. I think any reasonable person would be angry about being betrayed by someone they trusted. But my anger doesn't change the facts of what he did. Kowalski continued her cross-examination for another 20 minutes, trying to establish that I was an unreliable narrator driven by emotion rather than facts, that my business was failing anyway, and that Marcus's actions were misguided attempts to help rather than calculated crimes. She was skilled at taking true facts, that we'd had financial challenges, that Marcus had expressed concerns, that small businesses often struggle, and weaving them into a narrative that made his fraud seem reasonable. But she couldn't change the fundamental evidence. The forged signatures were still forged. The stolen money was still stolen. The lies to our clients were still lies. And the systematic nature of Marcus's actions over 8 months was still impossible to explain as impulsive mistakes or misguided help. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I felt like I'd been through a battle. Kowalski had raised doubts about my competence and motivations, but she hadn't been able to explain away the documentary evidence of Marcus's crimes. Torres called several more witnesses. Detective Rodriguez to testify about the financial crimes investigation, Sofia to describe the impact on our business and employees, and Jeremy to explain how the restaurant industry actually worked and why Marcus's claims about our pricing and practices were unfounded. The most damaging witness for Marcus's defense turned out to be Frank Kozlowski himself. Torres had managed to track him down in Seattle, where he was apparently running a similar investment scam under a different name. Facing his own criminal charges, Frank had agreed to testify in exchange for consideration in his sentencing. Mr. Kozlowski, Torres asked, when the defendant Marcus Vasquez approached you about investing in your construction partnership, what did you tell him about the likelihood of success? Frank, a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. I told him it was a high-risk venture and that he could lose everything he invested. Did you provide him with any documentation of your previous business failures or bankruptcy filings? No, but I didn't hide them either. Anyone who did basic research would have found that information. In your opinion, would a reasonable person have invested $43,000 in your partnership given your business history? Frank shrugged. Probably not. But Marcus seemed convinced that his wife was an even worse investment risk than I was. The courtroom was completely silent after Frank's testimony. He'd essentially confirmed that Marcus had knowingly invested stolen money in a venture he understood was likely to fail, and that his motivation was spite toward me, rather than any genuine belief in the partnership's potential. When it came time for Marcus to testify in his own defense, I watched him walk to the witness stand with the same confident stride he'd always used when he was about to explain why everyone else was wrong, and he was right. He looked directly at Judge Hendricks as he was sworn in, projecting the image of a reasonable man who'd been unfairly accused by his unstable wife. Kowalski walked him through his version of events. How he'd grown increasingly concerned about my business practices, how he'd tried unsuccessfully to discuss his worries with me, how he'd finally felt compelled to take action to protect our joint assets from my poor decisions. He portrayed himself as a devoted husband driven to desperate measures by his wife's refusal to accept reality. Mr. Vasquez, Kowalski asked, when you redirected funds from the catering business accounts, did you intend to harm your wife or her business? Absolutely not, Marcus replied, his voice sincere and pained. I love Elena. Everything I did was because I was trying to protect her from herself. She's a wonderful cook and a caring person, but she doesn't understand business or finance. I couldn't stand by and watch her destroy our financial future. It was a masterful performance, and I could see some people in the courtroom nodding sympathetically. Marcus had always been persuasive when he wanted to be, able to present his perspective in ways that made his critics seem unreasonable or emotional. But Torres's cross-examination revealed the flaws in Marcus's victim narrative. Mr. Vasquez, if you were so concerned about your wife's business practices, why didn't you discuss your concerns with her business partner, Sofia Chen? Marcus hesitated. I didn't think it was appropriate to go behind Elena's back. But you did go behind her back when you forged her signature and stole money from her accounts, correct? I didn't steal anything. Those were joint assets. Mr. Vasquez, the business account you took money from was registered solely in your wife's name and that of her business partner. You had no legal claim to those funds, did you? As Elena's husband, I had a right to protect our family's interests. Did you have a right to forge her signature? I was acting in her best interests. That's not what I asked. Did you have the legal right to forge your wife's signature on business documents? Marcus's confident facade began to crack. I was trying to prevent a bigger disaster. Mr. Vasquez, yes or no? Did you have the legal right to forge your wife's signature? No, but thank you. And did you have the legal right to impersonate your wife to clients and vendors? I was trying to minimize damage to our reputation. Yes or no, Mr. Vasquez? Did you have the legal right to impersonate your wife? No. Torres continued systematically dismantling Marcus's justifications, forcing him to admit that regardless of his motivations, his actions had been legally and ethically wrong. With each reluctant admission, Marcus looked less like a concerned husband and more like a man who'd been caught committing crimes and was desperately trying to rationalize his behavior. The moment that destroyed his credibility completely came when Torres asked about the Frank Kozlowski investment. Mr. Vasquez, you testified that you invested your wife's money in Mr. Kozlowski's construction partnership because you believed it was a sound business opportunity. Is that correct? Yes. But you also heard Mr. Kozlowski testify that he told you the investment was high risk and that you could lose everything. How do you reconcile those statements? Marcus looked genuinely confused, as if he'd forgotten that Frank had already testified. Well, all investments involve some risk. Mr. Vasquez, Mr. Kozlowski also testified that you told him your wife was a worse investment risk than he was. Do you recall making that statement? The courtroom was completely silent as Marcus realized he'd been caught in a contradiction. If he denied making the statement, he'd be calling Frank a liar about something that wasn't material to Frank's own case. If he admitted it, he'd be confirming that his investment decision was motivated by animosity toward me rather than financial logic. I may have expressed frustration about Elena's business decisions, Marcus said finally. Mr. Vasquez, isn't it true that you invested in Mr. Kozlowski's partnership not because you believed it would succeed, but because you wanted to punish your wife for running a business you disapproved of? That's not true. Then why did you wait until your wife's business had accumulated significant working capital before you decided it was failing? I was hoping she would come to her senses. And when she didn't come to her senses by building a successful business with growing profits and an expanding client base, you decided to destroy it? Kowalski objected, but the damage was done. Marcus had essentially admitted that his actions were punitive rather than protective, that he'd been motivated by disapproval of my success rather than concern about failure. When Torres finished his cross-examination, Marcus looked deflated and defeated. The confident narrative he'd constructed about being a protective husband had crumbled under scrutiny, revealing the petty vindictiveness that had actually motivated his crimes. Judge Hendricks called a brief recess before hearing closing arguments, and I used the time to process what I'd just witnessed. For 15 years, Marcus had been my harshest critic and my greatest source of self-doubt. He'd convinced me that my dreams were impractical, my business sense was poor, and my judgment was unreliable. But watching him try to justify his betrayal in court, I finally saw him clearly. Marcus wasn't the practical, rational partner he'd always claimed to be. He was an insecure man who couldn't tolerate his wife's success because it threatened his sense of superiority. Rather than celebrating my achievements or supporting my growth, he'd systematically undermined me to maintain his position as the competent one in our relationship. When court reconvened, Torres delivered a closing argument that focused relentlessly on the evidence. Your Honor, this case is not about marriage problems or business disagreements. It's about crime. The defendant forged documents, stole money, and committed fraud. His motivations don't change the fact that his actions were illegal, and his victim's business success doesn't justify his decision to destroy it. Kowalski's closing argument tried to refocus attention on my supposed incompetence and emotional instability, but it felt desperate after Marcus's disastrous testimony. Your Honor, Marcus Vasquez made mistakes, but they were the mistakes of a loving husband trying to protect his family from financial ruin. The prosecution wants to criminalize marriage problems and business disagreements. That's not justice. That's vindictiveness. Judge Hendricks deliberated for less than 30 minutes before returning to deliver her ruling. Having reviewed the evidence and testimony presented today, I find probable cause to believe that the defendant Marcus Vasquez committed the crimes charged. The evidence shows a pattern of deliberate fraud, forgery, and theft that cannot be explained or excused by marital concerns or business disagreements. This case will proceed to trial. The gavel came down with finality, and I felt 15 years of self-doubt and second-guessing fall away. A judge who'd heard all the evidence, all the justifications, all the attempts to portray me as incompetent or irrational, had concluded that Marcus was a criminal, and I was his victim. As we walked out of the courthouse, Sofia squeezed my arm. "How do you feel?" I took a deep breath of the cool Portland air and smiled, like I can finally start rebuilding everything he tried to destroy. But as we reached the courthouse steps, I heard Marcus's voice behind me, loud and desperate and filled with the rage of someone who'd finally been held accountable for his actions. "You're nothing!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "You hear me, Elena? You're nothing without me. Your business was garbage. Your cooking is mediocre. And you'll never amount to anything more than a failed restaurant owner who had to destroy her own marriage to feel important." The words hit like physical blows, 15 years of suppressed contempt finally spoken aloud. But instead of crushing me, they clarified everything. This was who Marcus really was. Not the protective husband he'd pretended to be in court, but a man so threatened by his wife's independence that he'd rather see her fail than succeed without him. Judge Hendricks, who had been walking behind us, stopped and turned to face Marcus directly. "Mr. Vasquez," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with men who thought they could intimidate women into silence. "You have just demonstrated exactly why your wife was right to pursue criminal charges against you. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Vasquez from the courthouse grounds." As Marcus was led away, still shouting about my inadequacies and failures, I realized that his outburst had been the final gift our marriage would give me. For 15 years, I'd internalized his criticism and accepted his assessment of my limitations. But hearing him scream those words in public, in front of a judge who just ruled that his actions were criminal, revealed them for what they'd always been: the desperate attempts of an insecure man to control a woman who was becoming more than he could handle. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of Bella Vista Catering's new location, a larger space in a better neighborhood that we'd been able to afford after Marcus was ordered to pay full restitution, plus damages. The criminal trial had resulted in a conviction on all counts, and Marcus was serving 18 months in prison, while Frank Kozlowski faced his own legal consequences. Sofia and I had not only rebuilt our business but expanded it, hiring the full-time staff we'd always dreamed of, and taking on the kind of high-end events that established us as one of Portland's premier catering companies. Maria had been promoted to operations manager, Jeremy had become our executive chef, and we'd even opened a small retail location selling our signature sauces and prepared foods. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was personal. I'd learned that I was capable of far more than Marcus had ever imagined, that my judgment was sound, and my instincts were reliable, and that the woman I'd become, despite his undermining, was someone worth fighting for. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was a potential client calling about catering their daughter's wedding, a 3-day affair that would be even larger than the Henderson event that had started this whole journey. "Bella Vista Catering," I answered, my voice confident and professional. "This is Elena. How can I help make your event extraordinary?" Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.